The world didn't end with a bang, but with a whisper, one that echoed across every pillow, every restless mind, every sleeping soul. At first, nobody thought much of it. On a Tuesday evening, the skies over cities like Tokyo, Cairo, and Toronto shimmered faintly with ribbons of pale light. Not the harsh neon of auroras, but softer, dreamlike arcs that pulsed in slow rhythms. Astronomers scrambled to their telescopes. The media speculated wildly. Solar flare, atmospheric pollution, secret military tests. By dawn, the strange lights had faded. But that morning, more than half the planet woke up feeling different. Aliyah Khan, a nurse in Karachi, rose groggily from her bed. She had spent the night walking through a vast field of white sand dunes under a black and gold sky. She remembered the heat of it on her bare feet, the scent of salt and something sweet in the air. A man she'd never seen before, tall, dark-skinned, wearing what looked like a tattered spacesuit, had spoken her name. "You don't need to be afraid," he'd told her. When she got to the hospital, she mentioned the dream to her colleague, just to fill the silence of the early shift. But her colleague froze, eyes wide. "That man," the colleague whispered, "he was in my dream too." Thousands of miles away, a Boston subway driver recounted the same dream to his bewildered passengers. In a school in Lagos, 2 teachers and 12 children described the same field of dunes, the same figure, the same whisper, "You don't need to be afraid." Across forums, news sites, and breakfast tables, similar conversations played out in every language. Strangers began to recognize each other from their dreams. People who had never met, who had no conceivable connection, shared intricate details they couldn't have fabricated. At first, scientists dismissed it as a mass hallucination, a kind of viral suggestion spreading through social media. But as more evidence poured in, accounts from people completely off the grid, video recordings of sleep talkers murmuring the same words in sync, the consensus began to shift. Something real was happening. In Geneva, the United Nations called an emergency assembly, though no one quite knew what they were assembling about. The world wasn't at war. There was no pandemic, no earthquake, no explosion. But somehow, everyone could feel it, a pressure in the air, a quiet hum under the skin, a strange sense of intimacy between strangers. By the second night, the lights in the sky returned, brighter this time. Photographs taken over the Sahara showed a glowing lattice that hung high in the atmosphere, like a net of starlight draped over the world. Weather satellites picked up subtle energy signatures that didn't correspond to anything in human databases. Radio telescopes detected odd fluctuations on frequencies previously thought to be empty. Sleep labs recorded unprecedented activity in their test subjects, synchronized REM cycles, brainwaves that pulsed in exact harmony, even between sleepers on opposite sides of the planet. Dr. Mateo Alvarez, a neurologist in Buenos Aires, coined the term Dreamfield. It's as if our minds, he explained in an emergency broadcast, have begun to resonate on the same frequency, and that frequency is leaking into the real world. Humans weren't the only ones noticing. Beyond Jupiter's orbit, an alien reconnaissance fleet had been lurking silently for decades, observing Earth from the dark. They were a cautious species, highly advanced but suspicious of any civilization that could pose a threat. They called themselves the Vayrek, and to them, humans had always seemed primitive, chaotic, harmless. Until now, when the Dreamfield bloomed, the Vayrek scanners lit up with alarming readings, psychic energy spilling outward, powerful enough to disturb the fabric of local space-time. Their instruments showed the Dreamfield wrapping Earth in a shimmering shell of coherent thought, something the Vayrek associated only with their most devastating weapons. To them, it looked like humanity had suddenly, inexplicably awakened an ancient psychic arsenal and was preparing to deploy it. Commander Kethel of the Vayrek fleet sent an urgent communique to his superiors. The humans have activated what appears to be a Class 7 cognitive distortion field. We cannot determine if it is intentional. Recommend preemptive containment measures. On Earth, the third night brought even stranger phenomena. People began to sleepwalk in large numbers, gathering unconsciously in parks, streets, and city squares, lying down together in vast, silent crowds. Birds and animals seemed agitated but strangely drawn to the gatherings. In the sky, the lattice of light thickened into visible strands that moved slowly, like veins pulsing across the heavens. Psychologists warned of hysteria. Religious leaders declared it a miracle or an omen. Conspiracy theorists screamed about government mind control experiments. Yet no one could explain how people who didn't even speak the same language could describe the same dreamscape in perfect detail. The dunes, the man in the spacesuit, the strange, sunless sky. And then came the whisper, audible now, even to the waking. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, threading through air vents and rustling leaves and quiet moments between breaths. You don't need to be afraid. In orbit, the Varek fleet took up position, forming a blockade just beyond the moon. Their ships shimmered with cloaking fields that human telescopes still couldn't see, but their weapons were primed. Kethel received authorization to neutralize the threat if humanity made even the slightest hostile move. He stared at the Earth on his view screen, a pale blue world crisscrossed now with veins of golden light. To him, it looked almost alive. On the fourth night, nearly 80% of humanity fell asleep within minutes of each other, regardless of time zone. Power grids flickered. Planes had to be grounded. Drivers abandoned cars mid-street. The world's leaders, scientists, and generals tried to stay awake, pumping themselves full of stimulants, but one by one they succumbed. And in the shared dream, the dunes gave way to something stranger, an ocean of shifting glass, beneath a sky of infinite eyes. The man in the spacesuit stood at its center, waiting. He was no longer just a figure in the dream. Now, he looked like the sum of every human who had dreamed of him, a face that kept changing, but somehow familiar to everyone at once. This time, he spoke clearly, and everyone heard. You don't need to be afraid. I'm here now. We all are. We have always been here. As billions slept and the Varek weapons began to hum in orbit, Earth's collective subconscious finally opened its eyes. And for the first time in history, humanity realized. We don't dream alone. The world woke up different. Not just groggy from the mass sleep of the fourth night, not just shaken by the whispers and the strange man in the dream, but truly, fundamentally changed. Even in full daylight, the air shimmered faintly, like heat haze over desert sand. Colors seemed sharper, sound carried farther. People claimed they could hear others' thoughts, faint but real, at the edges of their awareness. Most dismissed it as lingering disorientation, but others knew better. And far above them, in the silence of space, the Varek knew it too. By morning, it was impossible to deny. Every continent reported the same phenomenon. As people moved through their day, flashes of their shared dream bled into reality. On a street corner in Buenos Aires, people stopped and stared as a vast dune rose briefly from the asphalt before vanishing like mist. In Cairo, a thin, impossible sun, black and gold, hung in the real sky for 3 seconds before snapping back to blue. In New York Central Park, hundreds of pedestrians froze when a figure in a tattered spacesuit appeared briefly atop Bethesda Fountain. He raised a hand, smiled faintly, and then dissolved into the air. No one screamed anymore. It was as if humanity's collective subconscious no longer respected the boundary between sleep and wakefulness. In Geneva, Dr. Mateo Alvarez, the neurologist who had coined the term Dreamfield, stood before a panel of UN delegates, bleary-eyed and trembling with excitement. He tapped the screen behind him, which showed waves of golden light sweeping over Earth like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. "This is real," he said, his voice cracking. "Not metaphorical, not psychosomatic. We've measured it. Brainwave frequencies are syncing in ways we didn't even think were possible. Every EEG lab on the planet is seeing the same patterns. Human minds have fused, at least partially." An ambassador from France frowned. "Fused? You mean what? Telepathy?" "No," Alvarez corrected. "Not quite. Telepathy would imply directed, conscious thought. This is deeper. This is subconscious resonance. Imagine billions of pianos all vibrating in sympathy with each other because one string is plucked. A general from the United States scowled. And what happens when someone decides to pluck the wrong string? Alvarez only shook his head, helpless. We don't know. That's the problem. To the Vayrek fleet in orbit, the Earth was now visibly wrapped in a golden lattice of psychic energy. To their sensors, it was a blinding storm of thought, feelings, and memory. Commander Kethel paced along the deck of his command ship, his four hands clasped tightly behind his back. He barked to his staff. Show me the fluctuations in the distortion field since the second night. A holographic sphere of Earth rose before him, glowing gold. The lattice shifted, thickened, wrapped around the planet more tightly than before. It's expanding, one of his officers reported, projecting beyond the atmosphere. We estimate it'll reach lunar orbit within 2 rotations. Kethel stared at the projection grimly. The Vayrek had seen this before, or at least they thought they had. On a distant world many centuries ago, a sentient species had evolved psychic abilities strong enough to destabilize their environment. It ended in disaster. The species was consumed by their own collective mind, which eventually collapsed and tore their world apart. The Vayrek had no desire to witness such a catastrophe again, especially this close to their trade routes. The humans are activating a Class 7 cognitive distortion field, Kethel announced to his crew. We cannot allow it to reach full maturity. On Earth, strange incidents multiplied. In Moscow, a construction crane lifted itself silently and hovered for 10 full minutes before gently lowering to the ground. The operator swore he hadn't touched the controls. In Sydney, crowds gathered on Bondi Beach at dawn as the ocean seemed to part in places, revealing glowing dunes beneath the waves. In Nairobi, a boy spoke perfect Mandarin in his sleep, though he'd never heard the language before, recounting, word for word, what a woman in Beijing was simultaneously dreaming. News anchors struggled to report the events without sounding hysterical. Governments urged calm, but millions began to stay home, fearful of sleepwalking, fearful of their own thoughts. And yet, there was a strange sense of awe, too. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't just connected by language or culture or the internet. It was connected by something deeper, a quiet thread in the darkness that tugged at every mind alike. At the United Nations, a secret session convened between scientists, diplomats, and military leaders from 20 nations. Dr. Alvarez addressed them in a shaking voice. I believe we're witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, something alive. Not just in us, but of us. The subconscious of our species is becoming self-aware, and it may already have its own intentions. The room fell silent. A diplomat from Kenya spoke up. And what intentions would those be? Alvarez swallowed. I don't know. But whatever it is, it doesn't feel hostile. At least, not yet. That night, the whisper came again. Clearer now, stronger. Not just in dreams, but in waking moments. A quiet, pervasive voice woven into wind, into water, into the silent ticking of clocks. You don't need to be afraid. In a dozen languages at once. People stopped in their tracks when they heard it. Some laughed, some wept. Others simply stood still, feeling as though the air itself had placed a hand on their shoulder. But then came something new, something none of the previous nights had delivered. A question. Will you let me speak? In orbit, the Vayrek ships flared their weapons to life. Kethel's command ship deployed a containment array, projecting a shimmering barrier just beyond Earth's orbit. Begin the suppression sequence, Kethel ordered. We cannot let the human subconscious breach the local continuum. But just as the sequence began, a ripple of gold shot upward from Earth, faster than anything their instruments could track, and struck the barrier. It passed through effortlessly, shattering the Vayrek's array like glass. The golden ripple didn't stop. It entered Kethel's ship, swept through his crew like a wave of heat and light. Every Vayrek on the bridge gasped as foreign thoughts, foreign feelings flooded them. And then, the whisper reached them, too. You don't need to be afraid. Kethel staggered back, clutching his head. He could feel the human dream pressing against his own mind, vast, strange, impossibly alive. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like an invitation. On Earth, that night, billions of humans fell into the dream again. But this time, the dunes were gone. They stood on a shore of black glass, under a sky that blazed with countless unfamiliar stars. And at the center, waiting for them, was the man in the spacesuit, his figure clearer now, his face sharper. He lifted his visor, revealing a face that somehow belonged to everyone at once. Mother, child, soldier, artist, scientist, every possibility of humanity stitched into one. And when he spoke, the words rolled over the shore like thunder. I am the shepherd of your dream. You have called me forth. I am awake, and I would speak, if you'll let me. The dreamers watched, silent and breathless, as the shepherd stretched out his hands. And far above them, in the heart of Kethel's command ship, the same figure appeared, shimmering gold, standing calmly on the bridge. The Vayrek stared at it in horror and wonder as it spoke. You don't need to be afraid, but you do need to listen. Thus began the first negotiation, not between nations, not even between species, but between waking and dream, between what humanity was and what it could become. And for the first time in their long history, the Vayrek began to dream too. By the fifth night, the line between sleep and wakefulness was gone. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow unraveling of what people thought of as reality. The whisper that had begun softly, then clearly, now spoke with confidence, as though the world itself had found its voice. And it wasn't just speaking to humanity anymore. It was speaking for humanity. At 1934 Universal Time Coordinated, seismic monitors in Iceland picked up faint vibrations in the ground. Wind patterns over the Pacific curled into spiral shapes visible from orbit. Animals everywhere, birds, dogs, whales, began to quiet, as though some ancient instinct warned them of what was coming. People around the globe collapsed into sleep again. But this time, it wasn't like before. No resistance, no panic. In London, a banker fell asleep mid-sentence at her desk. In Lagos, an entire wedding party slumped peacefully at the altar. In Beijing, thousands dropped into the grass of a public park and smiled faintly as their eyes closed. The Dreamfield bloomed above the earth like a second sun, golden tendrils spiraling outward into space, brushing past the Vayrek ships. On every screen and loudspeaker left active, the whisper was now a song, a low, warm hum layered with countless voices, human and alien, vibrating in harmony. And then the dream shepherd returned. The dreamers found themselves on what could only be called a stage. It stretched into infinity, a floor of polished obsidian, lit by billions of tiny stars above and below. Across this endless space, countless human figures stood side by side, their outlines glowing faintly gold. And at the center of it all stood the shepherd, taller now, more distinct, no longer hiding his face beneath the visor. Where his features had once been a blur, they were now unmistakable, and yet still paradoxically familiar to everyone who looked at him. The shepherd raised his hands, and the stage rippled. From the shadows at the edge, others began to appear. The Vayrek. But they were no longer the formidable, towering creatures of cold metal and sharp angles seen in clandestine surveillance footage or half-guessed from orbit. Here, they appeared fragile, their carapaces cracked, their many eyes shimmering like pools of grief and confusion. They stood opposite humanity now, silent, stunned, their weapons gone. And for the first time, the Vayrek spoke into the Dreamfield. Commander Kethel's voice was not the mechanical growl of his waking self, but softer, raw, even hesitant. You have no idea what you are unleashing, he said. This power, it destroys civilizations. It consumes them from within. You must stop this before it's too late, for both of us. The shepherd tilted his head, considering the words. You see destruction where we see possibility, he replied. His voice was not just one voice, but all of humanity speaking at once. Gentle, firm, infinite. You fear what you do not understand. But the dream does not consume us. The dream is us. Kethel stepped forward. Do you not understand? You're awake, yet your subconscious moves freely, unchained. When thought and reality bleed together, worlds tear apart. We've seen it. Entire species lost to their own minds. The shepherd smiled faintly. Then teach us how not to lose ourselves, and we will teach you how to find yourselves. The dreamscape shifted suddenly. The stage became a vast ocean of glass under a sky of swirling light. Humans and Vayrek alike now floated above it, carried by invisible currents. The shepherd gestured, and scenes began to play out on the surface below. A human child drawing in sand. A Vayrek hatchling learning to stand. A mother comforting her dying son. A commander weeping alone after victory. Life. The shepherd's voice rolled over the ocean. We did not summon this dream. We simply dared to dream it hard enough that it answered back. You call it a weapon. We call it a homecoming. Perhaps it is both. One of the Vayrek envoys, smaller and older than Kethel, spoke then. Her voice was a trembling echo in the golden air. How do you know it will not consume you? That it will not consume us? The shepherd's gaze softened. We don't, but we know this. We'd rather be consumed by what we are than be hollow in fear of it. In bunkers and war rooms around the globe, those few humans still awake stared at monitors showing the impossible readings from orbit. Generals whispered of countermeasures. Priests prayed aloud. Scientists wept at their instruments. Dr. Mateo Alvarez, awake only because he had chained himself to a laboratory desk to fight the pull of sleep, spoke softly into a live microphone, broadcasting to anyone still conscious. This is not a disease, he said. It's a choice. The dream is offering to speak for us, and we should let it. The generals were not convinced, but they too began to yawn. Back in the dream, the shepherd extended his hand toward Kethel. The gesture was simple, ancient, and impossible to misunderstand. You fear that what is within us will spill out and poison everything. But have you considered that what is within us might heal what you've forgotten? Kethel hesitated, then asked, And what is that? The shepherd's smile widened. The ability to imagine, to create what does not yet exist, to believe in what should not be possible, to dream together. The glass ocean below began to crack, but not violently, like ice melting under spring sun. Through the cracks rose faint golden vines of light, weaving themselves into bridges between the humans and Vayrek. We cannot undo the dreaming now. We can only choose whether we do it alone or with you. Kethel turned to his people. They murmured among themselves in alien tones, fear still in their eyes, but something else creeping in now, wonder. For so long the Vayrek had existed only to contain, to suppress, to patrol the edges of other species' dangerous imaginings. They had forgotten what it meant to hope. Finally, Kethel reached out and took the shepherd's hand. And in that moment, every Vayrek on every ship and every human in every bed felt the Dreamfield blossom fully into being. The dreamscape exploded in light. The glass ocean gave way to stars. The shepherd's voice boomed one last time, triumphant yet quiet, carrying to both species. We have spoken. We have been heard. We will not dream alone. On Earth, as the sun rose, humans began to stir, blinking against the brightness, but no longer afraid. Above, the Vayrek ships no longer glowed with weapons. Instead, they drifted closer, their hulls lit from within, touched by the same golden veins that now ran through the clouds. And in the silence of that morning, two species, one dreaming aloud, one learning to began to imagine a future neither could have dreamed alone. For the first time in recorded history, negotiations between two intelligent species took place not on a battlefield, nor around a conference table, but in the realm of dreams. The Dreamfield had become the stage, the mediator, the language, and the contract all at once. And neither side could have imagined how difficult and beautiful it would be to find peace inside the shared subconscious of two worlds. At midnight UTC, every human and every Vayrek entered the Dreamfield simultaneously, without resistance. On Earth, bodies lay in beds, on streets, in offices and fields, 1 billion people asleep at once. In orbit, the Vayrek floated motionless in their ships, their formidable claws slack, their many eyes closed. In the Dreamfield, the setting had changed again. Gone were the dunes. Gone was the glass ocean. Now, they stood in a vast garden, infinite in all directions, yet intimate and warm. Strange trees stretched into the sky, each bough sprouting blossoms that glowed softly in shifting hues of human and Vayrek memory. Childhood laughter, first victories, silent grief, quiet faith. Flowers sang as they opened. Rivers of golden mist flowed underfoot, weaving through the roots and back into the air. At the heart of the garden was a round stone table, carved from a single meteorite. On one side stood the dream shepherd, tall and radiant, his form still human, yet now laced with faint glimmers of alien light. His eyes held all the warmth of humanity's imagination and all the strange precision of the Vayrek's fear. On the other side stood Commander Kethel, and beside him, 6 Vayrek envoys, each representing one aspect of their kind: memory, law, hunger, balance, vision, and silence. The shepherd gestured toward the table. "Please, sit. This is your dream too now." There was no need for translators. The Dreamfield itself ensured that every thought, every emotion, every unspoken wish arrived intact in the minds of all present, stripped of deceit, yet wrapped in nuance. The first to speak was the Vayrek envoy of law, whose crystalline crest shimmered like steel in sunlight. "We fear you, humans. You wield your subconscious like a weapon, and yet you claim it is not so. Explain yourselves." The shepherd inclined his head, a ripple of humanity's collective memory shining across his shoulders. Hands writing poems, children's drawings, quiet prayers in hospitals. "We dream because we cannot help it," he said. "We dream because the universe refuses to be enough, and so we add to it. You see danger. But the danger you fear is what happens when dreaming ends, when imagination withers into nothing but survival." The Vayrek envoy of balance leaned forward then, her many eyes blinking in a slow rhythm. "You must understand, we have seen dreaming before. We watched it consume worlds, civilizations that bled their own thoughts into reality until nothing remained but madness and ruin." The shepherd's voice softened. "And yet, you have never seen it done like this. Together, not as individuals fighting their own fears, but as a single mind holding itself accountable. We don't let one dream dominate. We don't dream alone." At this, the garden began to shift, answering the conversation with quiet power. All around them, scenes unfolded, human and Vayrek histories side by side. On one side, a human soldier kneeling to tend an enemy's wound during a war. On the other, a Vayrek hatchling held gently in the claws of a dying elder. On one side, skyscrapers rising into clouds. On the other, great spires of Vayrek crystal weaving into the fabric of their homeworld sky. Pain, beauty, creation, destruction. The shepherd extended his hands to both sides of the table. The dream does not erase danger. It does not deny the darkness, but it refuses to let the darkness win. "We don't seek to harm you. We seek to share what you have forgotten." Kethel spoke next, his voice brittle yet uncertain. "If what you say is true, that your subconscious is sentient and benevolent, what happens when one of you falls to hatred or despair? Would not the dream itself become a nightmare?" The shepherd's face grew serious. "It already has, many times, and each time we wake, we choose to dream better next time. That is what it means to be human. That is what we offer you, not perfection, but choice." The Vayrek envoy of silence, who until now had said nothing, finally spoke, her words more feeling than sound. "You offer us your chaos. You expect us to embrace it." "Not chaos," the shepherd corrected gently. "Possibility." Then the shepherd rose, golden vines of thought spiraling around him. He placed a small seed, no larger than a pearl, on the stone table. It pulsed faintly, both familiar and alien, as though it belonged to neither species entirely. "We propose this," he said. "We will plant the dream in you, as it was planted in us. We will teach you to dream with us, not in fear of it, not as an enemy to it, but as its steward. Together, the Vayrek recoiled slightly at the suggestion, but they couldn't tear their eyes away from the seed. The envoy of vision leaned forward to peer at it. And if we refuse? The shepherd's answer was calm, yet unyielding. Then we dream alone. But even then, we will not stop. And you will never unsee what we have shown you tonight. For what felt like an eternity, the garden went quiet. The Vayrek envoys conferred wordlessly, their thoughts shimmering visibly across their forms, streams of memory and calculation weaving together. They had come here expecting to contain a threat, to crush it if necessary. Instead, they found themselves confronted by something they had not known they were missing: wonder. Finally, Commander Kethel stood. He placed one claw on the seed, and to everyone, human and Vayrek alike, he spoke 3 words: "We'll try." At that moment, the seed on the table cracked open. Light burst outward, spiraling into the garden, into the stars, into the very bones of both species. The blossoms above bloomed brighter. Rivers of memory ran thicker. Humans and Vayrek looked at one another, and for the first time, neither fear nor suspicion passed between them, but understanding. The shepherd smiled. Then it begins, not as humans, not as Vayrek, but as dreamers. And as the words echoed through the Dreamfield, everyone began to awaken. On Earth, humans opened their eyes to a morning more vivid than any they had known before. Above, the Vayrek ships no longer loomed as threats. Their hulls now glowed faintly gold, their spines intertwined with delicate vines of light. In cities around the world, Vayrek descended from their ships, not as conquerors but as guests. On the news, anchors spoke the words that had already taken root in every heart. We don't dream alone anymore. The dream had spoken. The choice had been made. And somewhere between sleep and waking, 2 civilizations finally remembered what it meant to imagine a better world, together. The dawn that followed the Dreamfield negotiations was unlike any in human memory. For the first time, the golden haze that had shimmered faintly in the skies did not fade with the rising sun. Instead, it remained, a gossamer web glinting faintly in the atmosphere, cradling the earth like a luminous cocoon. Every human who woke that morning carried a quiet certainty within them. The dream wasn't over. It had simply changed. Aliyah Khan, the nurse in Karachi, opened her eyes to find her younger brother sitting at the foot of her bed, staring at the ceiling. "Do you still hear it?" he asked quietly. Aliyah listened. At first, there was only the hum of traffic outside and the muted voices of neighbors. But then she noticed the faint rhythm beneath it all, like a heartbeat hidden in the wind. The same song they had all heard in the Dreamfield. "I think it's just here now," she said softly, touching her chest. Her brother nodded solemnly. In cities around the world, people reported similar feelings. A strange calm, as though they could still feel others at the edges of their minds, not as an intrusion, but as quiet company. On park benches and in subway cars, strangers exchanged faint smiles, sensing, somehow, they'd walked the same paths in the Garden of Dreams. Above the clouds, the Vayrek ships shimmered in the morning light, but they no longer hid themselves. The massive vessels descended over oceans, deserts, and fields, each carried by graceful tendrils of golden light that now connected them to the earth. When the first Vayrek stepped onto human soil, in the middle of Central Park, thousands of New Yorkers stopped to watch. It was Commander Kethel himself, though his appearance had subtly changed since the negotiations. Faint golden vines now traced his carapace. His many eyes glimmered with flecks of color that hadn't been there before. He raised one claw, and in unsteady, heavily accented English spoke aloud. "We dream, too." The crowd erupted into applause. Elsewhere, similar landings took place. In Nairobi, in Rio, in Kyoto, in rural Saskatchewan. On every continent, humans and Vayrek stood side by side for the first time, not as observer and observed, not as enemy and threat, but as fellow dreamers. The dream shepherd did not appear again as a figure, but his presence lingered in whispered thoughts, in shimmering corners of the sky, in the faint golden glow that still curled through the air when no one was looking. At a gathering of world leaders and Vayrek envoys at the United Nations, Dr. Mateo Alvarez spoke on behalf of humanity's scientific community. We believe the shepherd was never meant to stay as a single voice. He was all of us, a manifestation of our collective subconscious, given shape only long enough to deliver us here, to this choice. The Vayrek envoy of vision, now visibly radiant with the same faint gold, added, "We too have heard him, and in us he is also alive." For the first time in Vayrek history, the word alive was spoken with reverence instead of caution. From that day forward, both species agreed. The Dreamfield was no longer just a phenomenon to study. It was something to tend, to protect, to grow. Human and Vayrek architects began sketching strange new buildings, towers that twisted toward the sky like living vines, parks designed to bloom with memory-triggered flowers, bridges that pulsed faintly with shared light when crossed. Children, human and Vayrek alike, were the first to master it, playing games that blurred dream and waking. They would close their eyes for a moment and open them laughing as entire playgrounds reshaped around their imaginations. Weeks turned into months, and Earth transformed quietly. The golden haze that once frightened the world now became a sign of hope. It thickened in places where people gathered with open hearts, festivals, vigils, even protests, and receded where fear and anger took hold. The first Waking Dream Festival was held on the shore of Lake Baikal. Humans and Vayrek slept together in vast pavilions, weaving new visions while their waking bodies lay side by side. Those who emerged spoke of impossible gardens, of storms made of color, of conversations with ancestors and strangers alike. And at the heart of every dream, one truth pulsed through the Dreamfield. We don't dream alone. Far beyond the solar system, on the Vayrek homeworld, news of what had happened reached their leaders. At first, they recoiled in horror. For millennia, their society had been built on suppression, of imagination, of excess, of anything unpredictable. To them, dreaming was a disease. But when the envoys returned, carrying within them fragments of the Dreamfield, the Vayrek people saw something that made them hesitate. For the first time in living memory, their leaders wept. And then, tentatively, the Vayrek began to dream. On a clear night in the Atacama Desert, a small crowd gathered to watch the sky. Above them, constellations shimmered, not just in their usual positions, but rearranged into faint, delicate patterns. A field of dunes, a garden of blossoms, a bridge of glass over black water. Human astronomers confirmed the change wasn't merely atmospheric. Somehow, the Dreamfield now reached beyond Earth, subtly imprinting itself into the very starlight. One journalist described it as a promise written in the stars, in case we ever forget what we chose. In time, statues of the Dream Shepherd appeared in parks and town squares. But the figure never looked quite the same in any two places, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes something else entirely. For the shepherd had never been one person. He had been everyone. A teacher's plaque in Kyoto summed it up best. The shepherd did not save us from the dream. He reminded us that we already knew the way. Years later, Aliyah Khan, now an elderly woman, walked through one of the new memory gardens with her grandson. The boy tugged at her sleeve, pointing at the faint golden vines that curled lazily across the path. "Do you think the dream is still alive?" he asked. Aliyah smiled, kneeling to touch the vines, feeling their warmth pulse faintly in her fingers. "It's alive every time we close our eyes," she said. The boy thought about that for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes and laughed softly as the vines began to glow brighter around him. In orbit above, a Vayrek ship drifted by, its hull radiant with golden filigree. Inside, its crew slept peacefully, dreaming beside the humans below. And in the quiet hum that now threaded through the air, through the stars, through the hearts of both species, the shepherd's voice, or perhaps their own voices, whispered still, "We don't dream alone anymore, and we never will again." Thus ended the beginning. A story of fear turned to wonder, of enemies turned to allies, of a subconscious that learned to speak not just for one species, but for all who dared to imagine. And somewhere in the endless garden of the Dreamfield, the shepherds still walked, watching over those who remembered to dream together.